Welcome to the Courage Never Quits podcast, where members of the West Point class of 1986 tell their stories. I'm your host, Paul LaFontaine. As always, the views expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and not of West Point, the Army, or any organization. Let's go to the podcast.
We're throwing you a curveball today. We're actually going to ask PLAF about his life.
I'm very glad to be here, John. Thanks for having me on the program.
Yeah, this is going to be a treat for me anyway, because I didn't really know you at school, and I've kind of gotten to know you a little bit because of this podcast, actually. So how did you start the podcast?
That's the best way to do it, right? Get to know each other eventually, right?
Yep. How did you start the podcast, or why did you start it?
I started the podcast because a lot of things fed into it. But the basic idea was I was in discussion about how we reconnect with classmates. And there was a lot of discussion about kind of email lists and things that might be 20-year-old technology. And I just thought it would be interesting if people told their basic stories about where they're at now, how they got there, kind of catch up on where they're at. And so that you see the podcast, it's like you get an update on the classmate, and then you feel comfortable reaching out and say, hey, I hear you're in South Carolina, or you're in Hawaii or whatever. So it was really just a way to begin to reconnect classmates was the basic idea.
All right. So
it's not really very formal around like, let's create a living history or let's,
right.
It's really not that. It's really just people just kind of telling their basic stories.
Okay. So basic story. You come from California. How did you decide as a 17, 16, 15-year-old that you wanted to go to West Point?
I'll give you the executive summary because Rainey, you are an executive. Okay. I, in third grade, read a science fiction book and couldn't believe it. It was about starships and bugs and all kinds of crazy stuff. And I was like, I can't believe that there's this kind of thing. So I began reading every science fiction book I could until I ran into Isaac Asimov's Foundation and Empire. And there was one character in that who was a general called Bel Riosi, who was based on the Eastern Roman Empire, Belisarius. Anyway, I read that and it said he was a master of strategy and his men loved him. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. They called him a general versus an admiral. And I swear to you, that's the reason that I got interested in West Point versus the other academies that literally said general, because I started then reading about generals, Civil War and all kinds of stuff. So I was like a seventh grader reading about Chickamauga, right? And so I got all the way to where I then discovered Avalon Hill War Games. And that was a whole different thing where you push cardboard on the board and there's the Germans going into France in 1940, the whole thing. So I was like reading military history in 8th grade, 9th grade. And as I was reading, I went in to the library one day and out jumped at me a catalog for a university. And there it was, United States Military Academy at West Point. It was like 1976 catalog or some crazy thing. It was an old one.
Yeah.
And I opened that up. And you know how people say love at first sight or they just know? I opened that up and said, that's it. I'm going here. So I went home and told my parents. And this was like 6 years after Vietnam had shut down. Well, actually, it was 5 years. It was the late 70s, 78, 79. And my parents were like, oh, great. Super, because, the military wasn't that popular in 78, 79. No,
especially.
So anyway, but I just that was it.
I can't imagine Napa was really popular either.
No, and I grew up in Napa, California. So that's another thing is we were in the Napa Valley. Most of my classmates and their older brothers and sisters were going out and working for vineyards, which was they were going to UC Davis. And it was very honorable to stay there in the Napa Valley because you were kind of at the center of it all. I worked at a winery in high school, folding boxes and stuff at the Christian Brothers Winery. So I was actually had connections in the valley in a small way, right? I could have gotten a job. The Silicon Valley was blowing up and we knew it, right? So I had a buddy in high school whose father was an initial investor in Apple.
Ooh.
And I went over to his house and he had an Apple I, which was not even really a computer. It was an Apple, as you know it, hooked up to a TV. There was no markings on it. And my friend said, oh, yeah, this is the future. And we kind of played around with it and played some little games and stuff. But so we knew it was coming in California because our parents and friends were all kind of aware that this was happening. jobs in Wozniak were like an hour and 15 minutes away doing the computer fairs. Like the entire universe was exploding in California, and I decided I'm going to go into the military. So I'm not, as part of this whole story, I'm not going to pretend I'm the brightest bulb on the tree. And the thing is, if I say there's a trend I'm going to follow, go the other way, right? Chuck Cushman came on, and he told the story about how he saw the catalog, the list of things you need to do. I did the exact same thing. And so I saw in that catalog, these were the characteristics of a West Point admittee. These are the people and that was my checklist list for getting in, right? So I had this checklist. And when I went into ninth grade, which is when I went to high school, went to a private Catholic high school, I had my checklist. And I just went down the list, join a club, do this. I just went down the list, and I got good grades because it said you need good grades. I did all the things, right? And two huge events like happened there that I have to tell about. So first, I went into the guidance counselor's office, and of course, they had that was when that famous the history that we teach is made with those that we taught, right? So I said, I'm going there, told the counselor that. And I was in there, she said, hey, I'm running, and this was she was a nun because we was a Catholic school. She said, I'm running late on a submission for a thing. I feel really bad, but I've got to get some names in for Boise State. I don't know of anybody who'd be even interested. Would you like to go? And I said, sure, I'll go to Boise State. And I found out much later that Boise State was like one of the most important things you could have on the equivalent of a resume, right?
Right.
So off to Sacramento, I went to Boise State, and that summer, and running for governor of Boise State was a guy from LA named Rafi Moranian, and our classmate.
Yeah.
Right? So I knew of Rafi when I was like a junior in high school, right? And to this day, I will absolutely, positively submit that I voted for Rafi for governor. He did not win. He should have won. And whether or not that election was stolen or not, we'll leave that on the table. But anyway, I've suggested to Rafi that we go back and we kind of have a runoff election and get him back in that chair because I think he was robbed, frankly. So my actual voting record is just a detail I don't want to go into, but I'm a big supporter of Rafi. And if I didn't mention Rafi in Boise State, he'd be very upset with me. So that was one big thing, but it was quite accidental that I went there. And the other was that I reached my junior year because, Ronnie, I know you're a baseball legend out of Indiana, and I did not make the baseball team in high school. So I hope we can still be friends. But anyways, I reached my junior year, right? And I kind of ticked all the boxes except the varsity letter. And they were very clear in the materials. Getting a varsity letter is kind of a thing to get in the academy. And so I was and remain an indifferent athlete. So I am athletic. I can run and jump and do things like that. I can throw a ball, for example, but I'm not enthusiastic about it. Like when I was a kid, I never practiced. Like I would go to practice, but I wouldn't go at home and like shoot baskets or throw the baseball or whatever. So I was an indifferent athlete, and that really catches up with you by the time you're in high school, because there are young men and women that you go to school with who are not indifferent. They're actually kind of enthusiastic athletes. And there I was. So I went for the football team because basically I went to a 1A school, and the way football worked is if they had a jersey they could give you, you were on the team. So I said, okay, I've got to do it. Now it's the least pleasant of the sports. And when you go out for the football team in high school, they don't have like the real athletes who want to actually play football, and then a section of guys who want to get a letter to get into West Point section that doesn't have to do the stuff, right? So they don't organize it that way. In fact, there's just football. So that was where I was introduced to the concept of really hurtful pain. Like those of us who've played football know that like a plastic helmet in the kidney is not fun, those kinds of things. And I was a player of low skill when I started. I weighed 125 pounds, right? And so, but I had to do it because I was going to West Point, period. So I'm on the team, and there's a thing you do in all practices, be it baseball like yourself or football, whatever, where you do drills where you want to develop skills, but you don't overdo it. So you don't take your like star running back and hit him as hard as you can because you don't want to injure him. That's just a natural thing. But as you go down on the ranks of the football team, there's a certain pro forma kind of thing you do in the drills where maybe you don't like knock each other about too much, right? So the coach really doesn't care about you as much, right? So anyway, so I was down in that layer where there would be the activity, but not quite the spirit. Let's put it that way. So anyway, there was only one guy on the team that was smaller than me, really nice guy who I had gone to school with for many years, named Lorenzo. Sadly, I've lost touch with him, but we always got along really well. Lorenzo weighed 120 pounds. I weighed 125 pounds, right? So we're out there on this drill. It's like a tackle drill. So I'm thinking, well, good. I'm paired up with Lorenzo. He weighs a little bit less than me. We'll do our thing. And then there's just one less bruise I have to endure as part of this journey to West Point, right? So I turn as part of the drill and he flattens me, like utterly flattens me, right? And he jumps up and he goes, "Put that on your transcripts." And the reason he yelled that is because everyone kind of knew that I was getting my transcripts puffed up to go to West Point, right? And so I jump up and I'm like, "Lorenzo, what the hell?" Because he was kind of a friend. And I jump up and the whole team is laughing. And if you take a 17-year-old and their ego and the concept of humiliation and you have an entire team laugh at you, that would basically be in the nightmare category, right? And what had happened is that the coach was 32 years old. He wasn't the most empathetic guy in the world. And I totally get it. He was insulted because he had heard that the only reason I was on the team was that I wanted to go to West Point and I wanted it for my transcript. And so he put Lorenzo up to it and the whole team was laughing. But in that moment, I was like, okay, this is what I have to endure to get into West Point. And I ran back to the line. I continued on and off I went. So that coach had accidentally handed me the best lesson I got in what was essentially a pretty idyllic childhood, is that sometimes you got to really suck it up to get what you want. And being on that football team was probably the biggest suck that I had to endure to get into West Point. But my goodness, what an excellent preparation for the academy. Like physical pain, yeah, humiliation, all those things.
Exactly. So you decide you want to go, you get in.
I get in.
What was the 17 or 18-year-old thinking on 1 July 1982?
That I'd made it.
That was it.
Box ticked. Really? Because it was like I had wanted to go to West Point since I was like in 7th grade. Box was ticked. So that created a weird inverted kind of lack of preparation, because I was like, okay, I did it. And when they handed me the uniforms, I was like, this was it. But then there was the 4 years after that.
So did you have any concept? Really?
I did. I studied it. I looked stuff up in the library. I read 1950s versions. I knew what bracing was. I actually did. I actually really, really researched it, but you can't know, right? Yes. So I remember after about a week of being there. Well, first of all, playing Avalon Hill War Games, you're operating at the division level. So I was thinking, I knew what regiments were. I knew what divisions were. I knew what armies were, all this kind of stuff from history.
Right.
Well, mostly World War II, right? And so like the idea of a squad, I'm like, squad? Why would I want to be in a squad? When am I getting into the division, right? Like this is, anyway, like it's just like, I actually envy the people who showed up knowing nothing, because then you just like were told what to do. Like I was like going through this complete rewiring of like, well, when do I get to command a division? It was crazy, right? So I remember being like 3 or 4 days in, walking around and just saying, well, this is just the Army, because we were in BDUs. I was like, this is just the Army. I could be in a Quonset hut in Kansas doing this, right? I was so outraged that they were making us throw hand grenades and rifles and what is all this stuff, right? It was really funny. I had to completely rewire myself that, oh, actually, it was more like football than it was like playing war games.
Yeah. So during Beast, did you have any second thoughts or doubts? Because
never, no.
Okay.
That same, like, I was going to graduate. There was no question ever, not a single moment did I say I'm not going to graduate.
So this,
not once.
you know, from talking to you, you have an incredible amount of self-discipline.
Well, thank you.
Because if you look at your history of, for instance, I'm only going to drink water for a year, or whatever you've been doing for how many years now?
Since 2015, so it's 10 years now.
10 years. Okay,
Yeah.
so did that discipline happen before? It sounds like it happened well before. Like it's one of your traits.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, that was like, it had a really formative effect to be like from 7th grade saying I'm going to do that one thing and then I'm going to bend everything to that. That was, of course, it was part of who I was. My parents were wonderful. They were very focused. They like, there was literally no distractions. There was no. We played sports. We did all kinds of stuff growing up and everything. We lived on 5 acres, so we were outside all the time. I mean, we just had an excellent childhood. But I was just always very like, okay, this is what I want to do. I have to think it was a little bit learned, but a little bit just wired into me.
So West Point must have been like nirvana to you, because it's all about.
At first it was. At first I was like, this is home. This is it. And then I was shocked at how like you had to. I did not. I was not really good at memorizing, and so that hurt me in Beast. And the thing that hurt me even more was that my Beast roommate was Tim Knight, our first captain, and that was horrible, right? Because he was the nicest guy from Massillon, Ohio. Like literally, you'd run through a wall for him from day one. Like I met him, like I was like, this is a great American. I love this guy, right? And I'd be exhausted, like laying on my rack. I just couldn't keep my eyes open. And he'd be over under his green girl with his flashlight studying poop after taps. He was that sorted out.
Right.
And he would remember it, right? So we'd go down in the morning. And I had Kevin Belmont, Tom Clymer, John Olvey was my one roommate. Tim Knight was the other, like 2 legendary roommates. And so the upperclassmen would come and say, Tim, Knight, the core. And he'd recite, the first stanza, and he'd say, sir, would you like the second stanza? Yeah. And he'd recite that, right? And the upperclassmen would be visibly disappointed, like, oh man, I can't get this guy on anything, right? Shoes perfectly shine, everything. Then he turns to me, LaFontaine, definition of leather, soft. All this pent up boom. So I had Madam Chu, Cadet Chu. We called her Madam Chu. She was our squad leader. She said, look, she pulled me aside one time. She says, look, I'm from California. I know what the deal is. You're a California guy, and you're just that much more slack than everybody else. I was that way when I came in here. Don't let our state down. How about that? How about that for a butt chewing? Anyway, so it was it was an amazing time being with John Olvey, whose father was Colonel, and then later General Olvey, who knew the academy back and forward, and then Tim Knight, who was so squared away. I was the funny kind of stepchild in that room, but then we had Belmont and Clymer and all kinds of great folks in our squad. Jake Brown was behind me. These were all folks that I went to C4 in as a plebe.
So, yeah. So what was your biggest memory of Beast? The thing that just sticks out to you?
Lock your knees, because I actually, we were doing if you remember when we learned drill on the plane,
yeah,
we'd go out and we just, we had the M14s and we were in our BDUs and everything. And I saw the stars. I'd never actually experienced passing out.
Right.
And I saw the stars, and it wasn't just me, but there was a sergeant that was training us, and he said, don't lock your knees. And it was just like this crazy experience. It was like, I almost like passed out. And I don't think I'd ever experienced at that age, like a loss of control of that way physically. It was just, even though I'd certainly had my bell rung and playing football or, being subjected to football. But I mean, that was one big memory I had. But I loved Beast because it was I wouldn't say easy, but it was very straightforward. As long as you wanted to be there, in my opinion, and would like listen, they told you exactly what to do. Like there was no, the memorizing the poop I didn't really like, but there was no deviation necessary. I can't imagine going there and not wanting to be there. That must have been horrible.
Yeah, I
But
would.
I was like, I'm where I want. I'm where I need to be. I'm good. So Beast for me was straightforward because I thought I didn't like the yelling and all that kind of stuff like everyone, and I stressed out about not having my shoes shine and all that stuff too, right? So, but I felt like I was where I was supposed to be.
Okay, we get done with Beast.
Yeah.
You're now in the academic year. What did you decide?
Yes.
What did you decide to study?
Oh, well, see, that's where if I were to go back in time, I asked this question. If I were to go back in time, I'm a writer, I'm a talker, I'm an active listener. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not numerate. And so I had decided to uh, get into computer science because that was what was going on back in California. And I was like, it was the, and I was, besotted with computers myself. I had a little Tandy color computer when I was in high school, the whole bit. So I thought computer science would be the thing to do because I made the mistake that many cadets make that like what you study there matters for your future. Ended up in computer science, which was abjectly terrible because you were trying to code and it was really not good. But I'd already declared for MSc. And so that was, if there's any regret, there's no regret, but like you want to talk about just sunk. If I'd have gone HPA and just studied like basic history, boy, I'd have been in great shape. So, but I ended up, let me tell you about C4, which was the basis for this. So I had, C4 was my company. It was in the long wing of MacArthur back right next to the Soup's house. It was a magnificent group of classmates. Paul Kelly, I don't want to leave any out, but Jake Brown, Roger Karstens was my roommate. Can you imagine that? I went from Tim Knight as my Beast roommate to Roger Karstens as my plebe roommate. Barry Peterson, Nate Wallace, John Greshner, Scott Pepple, Kay Hall, Dosh. I mean, this is like the people that we hung out with. And I apologize for every cowboy that I missed in that list. But I mean, I love that group. We really, really had a very tight knit group because it was a Hayes company. And so I really enjoyed being with that group. And Karstens is now a very serious man, a man of great note. But he's an incredibly funny guy, and he and I just decided we were going to laugh our way through the first half of plebe year. And Barry Peterson was in the room with us, Sacramento guy. So we were always cutting up. I mean, we always had some kind of nonsense going on there. So much so that our squad leader, Dave Alberga, kind of got that we were funny guys. And Dave and I are actually, and Roger, we're all three, and Barry as well, good friends to this day. But another seminal moment was boxing. I went over to boxing and a different athlete went over to boxing, and there was a gentleman named Kiekenmeister. I'm not pronouncing it right. He didn't graduate with us, but he was a Golden Gloves boxer. And I think he validated out after a couple of rounds where he really got into it. He was I think I can't speak on his behalf, but I think he was a little frustrated at being at the academy, and he took it out of the ring because that was one thing he knew how to do. Todd Gile knows him actually, but this guy was a very good boxer, and that's how we started, like on the receiving end of some of his ministrations, and that was another one where boxing was like, okay, this is a serious thing that might knock me out of this place. And using some of that old like stick-to-itiveness I had to get through boxing. And I think I actually lost every fight by the bell, but just I stayed standing for all 5 fights. So I graduated, or I passed it.
Right.
But not a big pugilist growing up. So despite reading all these accounts of combat and bayonet fights and knowing how the bayonet works conceptually, not a lot of pugilism growing up, and so boxing was a real shock. And academics were as well. Academics were just mind blowing to me in terms of how fast that came at me, so I ended up over in computers thinking, oh, that'd be fun to do that, and that was a mistake.
Yeah. So then, did you do computer? I thought you did math.
I did. I dropped out of computer science and went into optimization and basically ops research.
Right.
because it sounded cool because you did projects that were around optimizing military outcomes, and I thought, well, that might be helpful later on. But it was completely like, okay, I got to get out of computers. What do I do now?
So it was just it was a lifeline, is what it was.
It was a lifeline.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I wasn't that excited about like becoming a mechanical engineer or becoming an engineer of another type. So
Right.
math seems kind of like a place to end up that would help me with my Army stuff.
So I was looking at
And it did actually.
I was looking at your entry into the yearbook.
Yeah.
And you took advantage of some of the stuff that West Point had to offer. See, as a Corps Squad guy, I just did baseball. That was it. That's all there was time for. But you did things like the flying club and
Yeah, and I'll make a pitch for the middle of the bell curve, right? So I like joking around that you were a D1 baseball player, I was a D1 marcher, right? So I was like right in the middle of the Corps. If I was in the karate club, but if they needed someone to go out and represent, my company, I was in the ranks. So I marched in every single parade we were supposed to march in, bar none. Like, because I was not in a club or in Corps Squad, but I was able to kind of sample everything. So if you actually look at the years, I was trying something different every year. Yeah. So I CPRC and flying. I took flying lessons over at the airfield. I was in the karate club. I went to the war game club meeting one time. I went to, I tried everything, and enjoyed it. I'm glad I did.
Yeah, because I mean, you had a completely different experience than say someone like me who I didn't even know most of that stuff existed.
Yeah, and it compared to today, it wasn't much, but I would go through the thing through the list. I actually went to more meetings and tried out more stuff that's in the yearbook just because I wanted to try everything and check what was going on, which is really that's me. I'm kind of interested in everything, right? Yeah. So to a fault in a way. So I would go to all sorts. I'd be at all sorts of crazy meetings, and I'd go to lectures that were just kind of open. I'd just hang out in the back and listen. Much to my studies taking a back seat because maybe optimization wasn't that much fun. So I wanted to go listen to a tactical lecture, instead, which was kind of cool. But I really did sample as much of what was there as I could.
Yeah, so that's kind of neat. I do have to ask you one thing though. Looking at your yearbook entry, what's your entry?
Yeah.
I3's very own Moo Baba. There's a story there somewhere.
There's a story there. Okay, so I'm a sucker for like pulling on strings, right? So I went in. I joined because I had such a miserable time in boxing. I said I gotta get my pugilism skills up, and I don't want to actually box. So I went out for the karate club, thinking that would be kind of a middle ground. And so I started reacting to karate the way I react to everything is I read books. So I read every book I could on karate. And then I got into kind of Zen and the Art of Archery. And then I started reading books on the Bhagavad Gita. I just started reading all sorts of stuff. And of course, at the United States Military Academy, when you bring in a book of, Zen, of course your roommates are going to immediately so I was rooming with Darren Moore and Ted Hanley. Ted I just had dinner with and Darren I saw in Denver just recently. So they were right after it, right? So of course, what you do at the academy, you have one of two options. You either become a shrinking violet and say, oh no, please don't leave me alone, or you just attack back into the ambush, right? So I went completely nuts, right? And so I started burning incense and, we all like all the extreme stuff. So I became a Rosicrucian, the Rosicrucian mysteries. But of course, a lot of it was just me just completely giving my roommates all sorts of a hard time, right? So they go, what are you into now? Oh, I'm studying the Rosicrucian mysteries. Well, why don't you study your math? Well, because that's boring. I want to study this other thing, right? So I would just go into everything. And my favorite thing is this. Good for you, Ryan. Yeah, I had forgotten about this. I got these tapes from the Monroe Institute where this guy had figured out, and the science now has proven that it's not true, but what the heck, it was the 80s, where if you put two different frequencies in your ear, your brain will modulate at a different frequency. And so he claimed you could go out of the body and do out of the body experience. So I spent a lot of time figuring, well, if I get where I could do an out of the body experience, I bet you that'd have pretty good military applications, and I could probably, get out of something, right? So I would listen to these things, but of course I would always tell my roommates, here's what I'm doing now. I'm going to see if I can float out of my body. And of course, right. Because what are they going to say? Well, they're going to say, oh, okay, we support you, Paul. No, they're going to say, oh, you're a fruitcake. We're going to call you Boo Baba PLAF.
You are from California. Oh, that's funny.
I went down in New York, was in meditation thing. Just trust me. The internet's not big enough to hold all the stories about that one period, but that's where that comes from.
But that's part of being in your 18, 19, 20s is experimenting, right? Figuring out
and at the academy, right? So we were all so like tight that we all had our hobbies became disproportionately, expressed. So like Judd Bass, great friend, sadly he's passed away. He was my roommate. He literally carried, I have to give him props because he carried me through our degree on operations research. He became my lab partner. He wrote all of our papers, and I would run to Mama Brava's to get him calzones. It was a good deal. He liked it because I was out of his way and he could just write the paper. I liked it because I got a little extra calzone out of it. Everyone was happy. But Judd was, he took his love of electronics to an absurd degree because he was at the academy. So we all had our hobbies, where we were going nuts.
Yeah, that's that time of life, and you're right. Everything got exaggerated there.
Everything,
no matter what it was going to be exaggerated. And I think that's part of the crucible, though, isn't it? Because you're competing against everybody. So,
well, and that was one of the things I really disliked about the academy, and I still actually kind of do not appreciate that part of our upbringing. Is it kind of like this stack ranking thing? Yeah. Where you got the top of the class and then the last in the class. And then it's kind of like this bizarre thing where you get the number one in the class and the last in the class and nobody else matters, right? And that's total rubbish because in an army, you don't send one guy who's the best soldier out, you send the whole team out, right? So to me, I think that was the least useful framework that the academy had. And so to this day, I'm actually not super enamored with all those lists and here's all the accomplishments and all that because it over-indexes for a few of us versus all the rest of us.
Sure.
Anyway.
So have you been back to school very much?
Oh, yeah. So I'm on the AMG advisory board. Got tricked into that by Joe Simonelli. Thanks, Joe. Simbo, he's a class 87. Right, so I go up for meetings. I'm going to go up here in a couple of weeks for a meeting. I'm on the advisory board. And I support the philosophy department in my giving. So because even though I was a math major, it's my way of saying, sorry, math department. The philosophy department gets my money because you guys were not nice to me.
So Colonel Giordano wasn't your friend?
No, they were not my friend.
I love Colonel G. I thought he was an awesome dude.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure they're all great guys. And Andy Napoli, who I just saw this weekend, was a math department P, and he always tries to fight the fight for the math department. Yeah. But
so you gave your money to the philosophy department, which
I did.
Which, according to your your entry into the howitzer, sounds like that's where you should have been.
I know, but the philosophy department there is like just and unjust wars at West Point now, so that's why I should have been. I should have definitely been there. I would have gotten much better grades.
Yes. So,
but I chose. But the grades in the stack ranking leads to kind of another little, we'll call it a loophole, right? So I chose military intelligence as my branch. And I would love to say that there was some sort of master plan, but I was looking at that. Remember that card we had with the little number 2 pencil? I was looking at that card on the day and my pencil was going infantry MI. So I'm not, it was literally a gut decision. Thinking fast and slow. I was thinking fast, right? Because I really didn't know infantry. I fell in love with all the kind of stuff around combat arms, but then MI seemed interesting, and I figured MI might be able to see some interesting stuff. I bet you didn't know because I back and forth. So anyway, I put MI infantry and all that, and I got the very last slot for MI because I graduated about middle of the class, just above the midpoint. But like if you look at that bell curve, right in the middle, right?
Yeah. So and, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no! So I got the very last slot in MI. Like,
so where did you? being the last slot, you would think you'd be going to Korea or somewhere like that. You
You'd
didn't.
think, wouldn't you?
You
Well,
didn't though.
here's a story, right? You always had you always wanted to, work really hard to get that slot to the 82nd Airborne or whatever, right? So you had to don't go out and, chase girls or drink or any of that stuff. Just sit in your room and study, so you can get that one. So I did not agree with that. So I might have gone out and enjoyed my time there, but I never really got in trouble too much, but I enjoyed my time there. So middle of the class, last MI slot. So I didn't spend any energy worrying about where I was going. I was taking the last slot. Went all the way down and I got a slot with the 4th ID in Germany. And I said, well, looks like I'm going to Germany. No problem. Fast forward, went to basic course, right? So I'm kind of a talker. I don't know. I make friends easy. So there's a guy named Tim who was not a West Pointer. And he was a nice guy. We hung out a little bit. We played Monopoly in a group and we'd have a beer or two on occasion. Not that I'd bring the beer, but if they had it, I'd take a sip, that kind of thing. So anyway, we go out to lunch and he's looking kind of glum. I said, Tim, what's going on, man? He says, well, my sweetie is class 87 and she just graduated and she just got her orders and she's going to Germany. And I said, oh, wow, no kidding. I said, I've got a slot to Germany myself. He goes, yeah. He says, well, the problem is we're going to get married. We're all in love and she's my lady. She's my sweetie. And I'm going to have to go down to Fort Stewart, Georgia. And I said, well, that seems like a horrible thing, Tim, that you're going to have to go down and sit in that swamp while your lady goes over to Germany because there's lots of guys over there and lots of Germans, right? So he goes, yeah, my lady. He was really distraught. I said, well, look, here's what I'll do for you because I'm this kind of guy. Why don't we trade assignments? I'll take Fort Stewart and I'll go sit in the swamp and you go and you have the relationship of your dreams. And he said, would you do that for me? And I said, absolutely, right? So we went back and we submitted a request to swap orders and Branch did it.
I can't believe that. That would have never even occurred to me.
They gave me a slot to Fort Stewart, Georgia. Now, if you remember, Fort Stewart's the 24th ID at the time, part of the 18th Airborne Corps. That was actually some of the top slots, right? And so I literally leapt probably a quarter of the class rank just by having lunch with a distraught, lovelorn fella. So I went down to Fort Stewart and met up with Jim Morris, Cheese Dog, Rich Cabalden was down there, Kurt Gills, God rest his soul, Andy Napoli, Rich Pasco, John Olvey, all the notables, right? And I remember going out to lunch because Cheese Dog's a MI guy like me. And I remember it just came up. Cheese, I was like, I don't remember you being such an academic stud, LaFontaine. You got here to Fort Stewart. I said, I just put the work in, Cheese. Sometimes you got to just put the work in to get what you want, He's like, man, that's great. You made it down here, right? So I don't tell that story very often, but yeah, that's how I got to Fort Stewart. So I got like a plum assignment out of it. And I got a chance to, have a beer or two and date a few girls at West Point. So, sometimes it falls your way.
Good things happen to good people.
Now, Branch got wind of that, just so we're all clear. It immediately sent a memo. They did not revoke our shift because the orders were cut.
Right.
But they immediately sent a memo and said, West Pointers are not allowed to do that ever again. So some West Point captain at MI caught wind of it and shut it down. So I snuck in there and got through right before they just shut it down.
So because of you, the Army has a policy now.
Well, you know what? If you're the source of a policy, then you've at least done something in life. I figure.
So your first assignment is Fort Stewart, Georgia.
Fort Stewart, Georgia.
Yeah, and I was up there at Hunter Army Airfield at the same time.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, I don't know why Fort Stewart is given such a good rep. I can understand why Hunter is, but there's nothing there.
Fort Stewart hasn't earned it. So a couple of really amazing things happened at Fort Stewart. First of all, it was top of the budget chart to go to NTC. So right. we got a lot of NTC time. And second of all, I was assigned when I showed up there, it was to completely a random draw. Terry Boylan was there, Jim Morris, all the MI folks were there. And you could either go to the MI battalion or you could get a slot in an infantry battalion as the MI guy. And I got a slot as the Battlefield Information Coordination Center, which is, I don't even know why that is a title at the time, but I as an assistant S2 for the 27 or at the time 221 Infantry Battalion. So I go down there and I meet the colonel. He looks me up and down. I walk out, and the lieutenant walks up to me, and it's Roger Dean Karstens. He's assigned to the Charlie Company, and we immediately said, "Dude, what's up?" And we immediately made plans to go room together. And Eric Newman is also a classmate. Had just bought a house, so we all bunked together at Eric's house. Just before that, I'd lived with Jim Morris and Dave Harmon in Harmon's house, but Harmon's got married and he kicked us all out. It's just one of those things where, like, one of the most fantastic parts of being a West Point grad is that, like, post-graduation where you're all bunking up because you're all basically, you have a trunk, your uniforms, and your field time, right? Yeah. So I think Eric Newman, Carson's, and I lived in that house, and we might have been in that house together maybe 3 times. So because they were 2 infantry lieutenants, I was an MI guy. We were always out, always gone, always out on some sort of.
I remember, right? We had an NTC rotation every 6 months.
Yeah, well, the NTC was just hot and just getting hot, and so so I went to my colonel and I raised my hand and said, "Hey, let me go out to NTC and scout it out for us because we're going to go out there and I'll find out some information." And my S2 was a guy named Larry Sad. He said, "Yeah, you go do that." Went out with a small exploratory group and connected up with my dear friend Jay Millen, right, classmate. And Jay was the scout platoon leader, and he was just ending his time out there at Fort Irwin. Jim Nicholas was out there. Dave Baum was out there, and Mark Wolf were out there. I didn't see Mark or Jim when I was out there, but I connected up with Jay. Jay kind of gave me the nickel tour of what was going on, showed me on the map some stuff, kind of gave me some orientation. And then I became kind of an NTC head. So I went out there maybe 4 times without my battalion to just kind of scout it all out. So I might have known a few things about the way the Op 4 operated, because I went out with the Op 4. It was part of the training, right? So it's been a lot of time. But Dave Baum he was in my company, I3, still a very good friend. He was stationed out there, so we'd hang out together and we had a lot of laughs and stuff. It was a good time. So NTC was a lot of it until Desert Storm. But I was pretty good at the S2 stuff because I was interested in it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a lot of reading and
it's a lot of reading and all that wargaming that I did, orders of battle and all that. My job was to learn the Soviet orders of battle, and it was what I'd done as a kid, and I loved it. So,
So you go to Saudi. We all know how that went. I mean,
well, what happened is my time as an S2 naturally ended, and they rotated me down. They were being kind to me because they said, "Oh, well, you're too senior to be a." Well, I went up to G2 first.
Right.
G2 plans, which was my dream job. And I'll just take a moment here. If I could have stayed in the Army for 20 years and been in a G2 plans at whatever level, I would have happily just gotten out as a major after 20 years, because all you did was drew on maps and gave briefings.
Yeah.
Which I just love doing. So in fact, for a period, I was a CG's briefer, kind of a daily briefer on small things. It wasn't a big formal thing, but I was so like into it. They were like, "Well, you brief the CG on what's going on."
You briefed McCaffrey then.
Yeah. No, it was pre-McCaffrey. It was Taylor at the time.
Yeah.
And then McCaffrey came in after him. But I love that. But they said, "Well, you'll never go anywhere as an MI officer if you don't get battalion time." And this is where I made a mistake going MI in a way, because they basically, MI was like, at the time, it was like a mirror of infantry. And the only way you got ahead is if you had MI battalion time.
Right.
And the MI battalion wasn't a battalion that rolled like an infantry battalion. It was kind of a support unit where you just take and you'd send off different detachments to support different parts of it. So it was kind of an organic support function. And so they said, "Okay, well, we're going to punch your ticket because you're too senior to be an XO or because I spent all the way through almost a captain in infantry battalions. And then I got a ranger slot while I was a first lieutenant and went and got my ranger tab. So I was like infantry almost the whole time.
Yeah.
In my mindset. And then they said, "Okay, well, the only thing we can possibly do with a ranger qualified first lieutenant who's about to become a captain is make you the S4. And that way you've punched your MI battalion time, then you go back," right? So I went from G2 plans where I'm like in the skiff doing these wonderful plans and all the stuff to like counting boxes. And you could not have put me in a more miserable job as the S4 of the MI battalion. And then they said, hey, Saddam Hussein just invaded Kuwait. Congratulations. You're going to deploy this battalion as the S4. Off we go.
Oh my God.
So off we went. Right. And I landed on the ground over there as an S4, but it worked to my advantage because when we got there, it was all logistics because we were just moving the divisions up and all that kind of stuff. So I was running supplies for the MI battalion, and the MI battalion was more complicated than an infantry or an armor battalion because the MI battalion was spread out so far. So I'd have to run, they'd need some parts somewhere. I'd have to run parts out there. So it was enjoyable in a way. It was a complex problem to solve, but I was heartsick because I really wanted to be looking at Iraqi divisions and figuring out doing the intelligence planning, which is what was my first love. Anyway, but it was running parts has its merits as well.
Well,
so
I'm sure
it helps me.
A lot of our classmates, just run into people.
I did. I had a funny Carl Tappert, your fellow baseball colleague, was his headquarters was right over there. So I went over and saw Taps on a couple of occasions. We just sit and BS and laugh, and it was funny because he was in an air defense group over there. So I ran into all sorts of classmates because I would go to the division headquarters and they were all there, right? So I was running into people all the time. So right before the war kicked off, like right as we were getting ready, like we were fueling up, ready to go, there was a change in talent in the intelligence community. So basically one person was asked to move out of his job due to a disastrous briefing that to this it remains legendary, and then it just created this kind of effect. And whether it was fought through or not, they moved me up to G2 Ops for the war. So I actually had a really good outcome because once the shooting started, I ran the night shift for the 24th Division's G2 Ops. And the night was when all the stuff was happening. And so I would always brief in the morning. I would brief all the majors, colonels, and even the brigadiers would come in and just say what happened last night. So they didn't have to go in and talk to the CG knowing nothing. Yeah. So like before the morning briefing, they'd come in and kind of get the scoop. So I got to brief them all. So just, map board stuff. Right. And I loved that because I would basically stay up all night, collect all the information, knowing they were going to come in. First thing, they all come in with their coffee, and then I'd brief everyone.
And it kind of goes back to your Avalon Hill days.
Goes back to Avalon Hill days. Now I'll tell a story about my dear mother. My mother used to give me such a hard time when I was growing up. She, because I'd have these games out, and she'd give me a hard time. She'd say, "You can't spend your whole life just sitting there looking at all these little pieces on a board." And I told her later that actually I did. It all paid off in the end. It made America safe.
I tell you.
Yeah, but when we came back, I could tell the internet's not big enough to hold all the Desert Storm stories. I mean, one brief one that I'll tell over a beer is that because my name was LaFontaine, I was given the task to go with a major named Fontaine who spoke French to take a tank over to the French Foreign Legion. And so we were going to deliver this tank that we'd captured, and so they could take it back to France and put it up as display. And so I traveled over, and they wanted me to go because at one time the Foreign Legion guy came in and grabbed my name tag and went like that, and he was all pleased because it was a French name, right? And I couldn't speak French, but his English was very limited. So anyway, so I went over there, and sure, I actually in real life saw Foreign Legionnaires sitting around fires, singing and drinking beer, like that actually really happens.
Legendary, yeah.
I was like, there you go, right? And anyway, so we came back down and went home. And when we came back, I went to probably 4 or 5 senior officers at the time, senior to me, not, what we've known later to be senior, but, lieutenant colonels and brigadiers, and said, I would like to punch out of the MI battalion circuit, and I would like to go into more specialized intelligence. How do I do that? Because my G2 actually had been a Phoenix guy in Vietnam, and so he knew that whole world. And I said, look, I want to go do off the grid, interesting things, because I don't want to be an Italian. And they all were to a person were like, you don't want to do that. You're going to ruin your career. You'll never get stars. And I said, I don't want to get stars. And they said, well, you're young. You don't understand. You want to get stars. And they just kind of blocked it. And I got angry and I quit, basically. Not knowing as a 27-year-old that I was just talking to the wrong people. Right. There's somebody in the Army somewhere. If I'd have gotten one phone call in to the right person, would have said, oh, you want to do that? No problem. Yeah, there's a whole community of us over here. Welcome to the club. Come on over. I had the top secret clearance and all that. So just, you know what I mean? Just come on over. I just didn't talk to the right person. And that's luck, right?
Sure. Well, and you're
also
the drawdown versus conventional versus,
conventional versus less. And I'm not talking about super secret stuff. Just literally, if I'd have been an analyst for, the Army Intelligence Agency, I'd have been happy, right? Just put me in a skiff somewhere and let me draw on maps. I'd have been fine. But also they were also really clear on you guys are going to be captains for X number of years, and you're probably never going to get colonel. I mean, they were really. But what was actually happening, like that 32-year-old football coach, is they were projecting their own fears.
Yeah.
All of them. They were just young guys projecting their own fears about their own careers, and they were just kind of beating me up about it. So I got out. And that was my Army career. Could I have stayed in for 20 and done it? Yeah. There was times when I think about it, but I've had a pretty magnificent life.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, it's not been bad since you decided to get out of the military. So what did you end up doing? You didn't go exactly.
It hasn't been too bad. It hasn't been too bad, Rainey, I got to tell you. I got out and did the whole junior military officer thing, had offers to go sell pharmaceuticals. And if the world's zigging, I zag, right? So I said, I want to do that. So I went to work for Pizza Hut as a regional manager trainee. And then I did that for a year and a half, got promoted. That worked out, but that was as a grueling lifestyle. That's the restaurant industry is the infantry of the civilian world. It was horrible. I had my son was born. So ding, ding, ding. I have a son. He's 31 years old. He was born in Houston, Texas. I'm very proud of him. His name is Luke. He's a tremendous guy. He is an engineer and he's numerate, and he makes sure that I know all the time that he is better at math than I am. So he's always doing math in his head and demonstrating to me that he has exceeded the last generation. And so he's a great guy. We talk all the time. We hang out as much as we can. 31 years old, doing great. He currently works for the Navy as an engineer, as a civilian. So he does weapons stuff for the Navy. Fascinating guy. He's actually been downrange twice. He was over to Iraq, and he's been over in the Middle East back when that was fashionable. So he's actually led as interesting a life as I have. So very proud of him. Good kid. So good young man. So he was born back then during that period. Fast forward a little bit, and I had a few jobs, and I got a call from my old plebe squad leader, Dave Alberga. And he said, you got to come out here to LA and you got to get involved. I'm in an internet company. And I said, Dave, I don't understand how you could work for a website. And he said, just shut up and come out here, right? So I got on a plane and flew out to LA. And Dave's path had taken him to Stanford Graduate School of Business, because Dave is a very intelligent guy. And since you might even watch this, I'll even add he's handsome as well. But, so he got me out there. And so I show up. And I did not have, I've been through a series of kind of operating jobs, and I didn't have a graduate degree or any of that. So I go into a room, and the first guy comes in, and this guy literally had been to Oxford. That was his education. He was the CEO, and he says, oh, you're Dave's guy. And I said, yeah, well, sure. He says, we really like Dave. Dave's been to Stanford, I said, yeah. I said, Dave's taught me everything he knows. And the guy laughs, goes, oh, yeah, everything? I said, well, no, maybe not everything. He's taught me everything I know, right? And the guy laughs, goes, yeah. So he walks out, and the next guy comes in. Oh, you're Dave's guy. I said, yeah. He said, well, you're like him. You run around, you're like a leader because of West Point. I said, well, he taught me what he trained me. And they said, okay, let me tell you about the company, right? So every person who interviewed me for this internet job basically said, oh, you're Dave's guy. And then that was the only question they asked. And all I had to do was say, yeah, I'm Dave's guy. And then they would talk about the company or their job or whatever. And in the end, they said, look, we're a little bit embarrassed. We can't pay you a lot, but we'll give you some stock options. What your job is to go around the country and set up different operations. And I said, okay, well, that's unfortunate you can't pay me a lot, but since I am Dave's guy, I'll go ahead and take it. And so I was working for an internet company.
And what was that?
From 0 to 60. Now, before that, I have to tell this story. This is a shout out to Darren Moore. Before that, I parted ways with Luke's mom. She's a wonderful lady. It just didn't work for all the reasons that things didn't work out. And I was on my back foot financially and in life. And the 10th reunion came and went. And I said, there's no way I'm going to go to the 10th reunion in the state of the situation that I'm in right now. And Darren Moore got in his car and drove with his wife and little baby at the time, drove to Indiana where I was. And he showed up and he chewed my backside. And he said, we all expected you to be there. You're Mubaba PLAF. You're one of us. You have to never miss another reunion. And he said it with love in his heart. It was tough love and it was wonderful. And that like really sunk in. So I said, yeah, absolutely. And all that. And I've never missed a reunion since, or any sort of thing, right? Since then. Now I do notice that Darren's missed a few, but I guess he invested early on. But that was an amazing classmate thing. And then the internet company was not a classmate, but a grad thing. So basically all the breaks in life were still coming from the academy, right? Yeah. So I joined this internet company through a series of financial maneuvers. That company was acquired by a guy who then used it to acquire Ticketmaster, the ticketing company. So it was like one of these kind of crazy stock deals that you only read about in history books, right? And so I ended up through a series of jumps and leaps on the executive team at Ticketmaster, which was an amazing stroke of luck because it just happened that way for a bunch of us, right? So I raised my hand during that period and said, hey, I would like to go to London and help Ticketmaster buy companies in Europe. And my CEO, who was, I had a good relationship with, he said, you don't know anything about buying and selling companies. I said, yeah, but we've got the good lawyers, right? And they said, yeah. I said, I'm pretty sure we can put a good deal together. He goes, go over there for 6 weeks and see what you can do. So I stayed, my wife we got married again. I got married again, and my wife Colleen and I stayed over there for almost 10 years. And what I did was I would travel around Europe and all the way down to India, and I would look for companies to buy on behalf of Ticketmaster. And so I'd find a small company, I sit down with a person and it turns out being an active listener helps. And I would buy companies and feed it into this network. And we built a European network. And I did that for 6 of the 10 years. But what a life that was.
So what period of time was that?
2003 to 2010, we were over there doing that.
Yeah, that had to have been interesting. I mean, but
it was a great America, the U.S. It was still coming off the back of 9/11 in terms of the respect and the good feeling. Iraq was kicking off in full force, so a lot of the podcast stories we hear about the folks over in Iraq. I got kind of through Roger Carstens. I met a guy who ran the private military security association. And he came over to London and I helped him set up some events in London. So I was hanging out with these private military guys. It was just crazy, right? John Guy, classmate, got me into the Naval and Military Club. I became a member there. So I would ruck up to the bar with all these Brits. And it was like I had wanted to go into this kind of some sort of world where I lived abroad hobnobbing, and I ended up doing it completely unclassified and for no reason other than I was just hobnobbing.
That's funny. So were you on the West End? Is that where you lived?
I lived in Earl's Court.
Wow.
And then our office was in Leicester Square.
Wow.
Yeah.
You were hobnobbing it.
Hobnobbing right at the center of it. I was actually in the office where the the gentleman that the Russians poisoned. I was in that office like 2 days before he got stabbed with the umbrella. The whole thing. Like I've got stories. Anyway, the internet's not big enough to hold them all. But yeah, I was over there doing that. But we we lived a good life over there, and so did that for 7 years. And it was my pleasure to give a lot of classmates tickets because they would come over to London. They'd reach out and say, "Hey, I'm in London with my wife and all that." And I'd say, "Here's some West End tickets and all that."
Yeah.
So that was a lot of fun. I had the greatest meal ever with Matt Eigel. Now, Matt grew up in Palo Alto, and I grew up in Napa. So we kind of commiserated on not being able to go back and live in our old hometowns because they outpriced us. But we sat out on this balcony and just had the most amazing meal, catching up on all the adventures that he'd had and that I'd had there. And it was one of those great moments hanging out with Matt in London.
I tell you what,
reconnect with John Landgraf, everything else. Yeah,
it's amazing. You can go anywhere in the world, literally anywhere in the world, and you will find a West Point graduate somewhere there.
Anywhere in the world. Yeah,
I think you can, honestly.
Yeah. Anywhere. I mean, and that's no matter whether I was in California working for a company or I was in London, there were just always grads there, and now it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So I ended that period came to a close, and I basically have lived off 4 connections in my career. So they called me and said, "Hey, we're doing a gaming company out in the San Francisco Bay Area. We need you to come help us sort this thing out." So I ended up in Palo Alto, this Mountain View area, working for a company called Playdom with a couple of good friends. And we were putting this social gaming site together. And they had me kind of organize the company a bit. And so I was in charge of HR, all kinds of stuff, creating a studio system. So I lived in Mountain View, did the full-on Silicon Valley thing, went to Sand Hill Road, did all that stuff, met with investors, we were considered one of the hot startups at the time. So we were hiring 1 engineer a day. So I lived in the middle of all that craziness. And that was a very fast lifestyle. And then we sold that company to Disney for a decent amount. And so then I became a vice president at Disney. And so they said, "Well, we're now part of this Disney gaming. What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm pretty good overseas because I lived over in London. Why don't you let me go put our Disney content on different countries' versions of Facebook?" Because at the time, Facebook hadn't gobbled up the whole world.
Right.
So he said, "Great. Here's your first class, accommodation, your first class authorization for flight tickets. Fly around the world and meet with social media networks to try to get Disney content on there." So I basically got on a plane and would just fly around the world. China, Japan, every country in Europe. I would hang out in Kiev before things blew up there, at gaming conventions. You come in with when you have the stamp of the mouse, it opens doors. And I lived that lifestyle for a year. So that was pretty good.
Yeah,
I'm not going to lie.
What did your parents do? How did you grow up?
My dad was a hydraulic high-end maintainer. He called himself an engineer, but he basically made hydraulic systems work. And my mother was a bookkeeper, is what they did.
So when you were 17, did you have any of those aspirations for any of the stuff that happened later in your life?
Oh yeah, I wanted to see the world, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was part of the West Point and there was nothing wrong with the world I grew up in. It was actually, my family is unbelievable characters. So there's a whole podcast of my uncles and their storytelling and my aunts and their quips. And I have a fantastic family, but I just always wanted to go see things and see the world.
So you had wanderlust.
Yeah, a bit. Right. And so when I got married to Colleen, my wife now, we've been married 25 years. We made a decision that we would optimize moving around the world over kind of tucking into a business, right? So for instance, I'll just take Pizza Hut as an example. if I'd have stayed at Pizza Hut and become a regional manager, then stayed there and become a super regional manager, then a district manager, then all the way up, and then a country or a state manager and all that kind of stuff, it might be that I'd be one of those guys of the class that, oh, look at LaFontaine. He became a C something O of the pizza business. And then I come in, they say, hey, pizza boy. And I say, oh, well, I'll tell you what, I was on a private jet and looking at pizzas, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But I just I wasn't wired to be interested in that.
Yeah.
So I would always try to move toward that. And so the Ticketmaster job I kind of created by going to the boss in a good way. And I said, hey, I said, I'll go live over there. And he said, I can't give you some fancy package. I said, no, we'll just live off the economy as if we're a British employee. Don't worry about all the extra bells and whistles. We'll just go do that. So Colleen and I took the risk.
Yeah.
And we thought we were going to go there. We were going to be financially really set back, but in the end, the exchange rate worked to our advantage. But so we just always went beyond, if you will.
So you prioritize experiences over
100%
over wealth or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm actually indifferent. I'm as indifferent about money as I am about sports. Now, I like having money. I like saving money. And my wife and I Colleen and I are actually both very frugal. We'll take a trip, but we'll shop it and things like that.
Yeah.
We're retired now, and we have just enough money to kind of keep the thing afloat. It's not like I'm gonna sit here at age 60 saying, my God, I need 5x the amount of money so that I can make a statement in the world. Right. Now my son is very upset about that because that means it's coming out of his end. But hey,
earn it yourself.
I'll send him a postcard.
Earn it yourself.
Hey, I'm in Budapest. Here's one of those little jib jab, like a little dancing Budapest. I don't know, whatever. Here's your jib jab. Live it up, son.
Yeah. So now that you're retired, right?
Yeah.
What does the future look like for Paul LaFontaine?
I've kind of gone back to my roots. Well, first and foremost, the source of the question in the podcast, what advice would you give yourself, is actually something I did to myself. And I said, if I could speak to my 80-year-old self, what would that 80-year-old self say back to me? Because when I first stepped out of commercial work I was 57, and I was like, oh, now what? Now what do I do? And you get all the range of emotions like, gee, part of the story is I was able to become a CEO of one of the gaming companies in that period when I was working. So I had that kind of sweet experience, and I did that thing, right, where I had a photographer with put makeup on me and take a picture of me for the PR, right? So I've done all that stuff, right? And so I kind of ticked that box. And when you in that, it's kind of disorienting because you're like, well, I used to be, Kevin Farrell, good friend, classmate and roommate, had the best quote about this ever. And Kevin's got a lot of wisdom, but the best quote, he said, I was a colonel. Then I went to the PX and people would pop up and people would look at me and they'd act one way. I retired the very next day and I was just some old guy. And it was just so brilliant because that is actually the thing, is you just become some old guy, right? And so there's the payoff is that you're able to do what you want, but the flip side is that if you really need to be the vice president of marketing for a major company, you're gonna have to struggle with it. So I asked myself, what would my 80-year-old self want? And the 80-year-old self would say, just people, just you and the baseball guys and Andy Napoli and Ed Pygott and, just classmates, just Will Duke, Rich Pasco, PJ Gross. Yeah, I just go through it, just all of them, classmates. If I look back when I'm 80 and say from age 60 to 80, I just was almost nearly a pain in the ass, like tracking down classmates and hanging out with classmates, then that's the 80-year-old self's going to go all good, right? So that's the first and foremost, right? On top of that, I really do still love history, and I really do love wargaming, and I love military history. And so I go to conventions now and I umpire war games. I am like one of those old guys that does that, but I go hang out with people who love war games. I'm literally in an online convention this week about how to war game it using AI. I'm like, yeah, all that stuff, right? So I have a YouTube channel with 2,500 subscribers about war games that I do. So I do that too for fun. But that's a people thing because that's for people. So I don't sit by myself and do it. I do it for people. So those two things, and then supporting family is what I'm going to do now. But it's just people, man. It's just gonna be all classmates and friends and people.
So, all right, I'm going to ask you a question instead of your normal question of, what would you, your look back, what would you advice you would give? I'm going to ask you a 3-part question.
Oh boy, here we go.
What's the highlight of your life? Who was your hero? And what's your heartache?
I think the highlight was my 50th birthday party. And this is in a life of crazy highlights, right? I mean, here's what I want. I want this to go on the record, right? On my TAPS article, and I'm going to be the last surviving graduate, so I'm going to have to write it myself.
You got to fight
I want to quote from. I'm going to quote from the rep where he says, "You people wouldn't believe," in Blade Runner, right? You people wouldn't believe the things I've seen, right? So I've got a lot of highlights, right? But my 50th birthday party, we had it in Morocco. And we rented the hotel in Morocco, and I had classmates. I had my sister come over, and it was just the craziest time because we just all hung out together. And it was like all my European friends and people, but then American friends. John Landgraf came over, Kevin Farrell came over, Dave Alberga came over, just getting together. And that was like the model. And the reason it was a highlight is that my Colleen put this amazing party together, but it was really, everyone had a fantastic time. So that is a highlight that I want to repeat. That's the model, right? So that's a highlight. He involves great wife. I wish my son would have come over, but he'd been bored sitting there listening to a bunch of old people getting drunk and telling stories. He's often, his cross to bear is he's often had to sit and listen to. Anyway, so that was a highlight. The hero's a little tougher because I think of we have this friend, and I'm not going to embarrass her, but her initials are SJ, so now she knows who she is, right? And she actually modeled this social behavior early in life because I'm a late in life extrovert. I always thought I was an introvert, believe it or not. But I didn't realize until I was told, hey, do you get energy from people, that I'm actually an extreme extrovert. So this friend of ours was an amazing technical extrovert. She just, the way she keeps in touch with people was an inspiration. Absolutely amazing. And I asked her one time, how do you do it? She said, do what? And I was like, okay, you just do this? And she says, yeah. So like my 60 for 60 was inspired by some of the way that she keeps in touch with people. Some of the things I'm doing with classmates are inspired by that. So she's kind of a technical hero of sorts in terms of the way that she keeps in touch with people. And so I mimic that. So if heroism is something you try to aspire to, that's something that I inspire to. In heartache, yeah, I think that's that one's fraught. Here's what I would say is, it's not really a heartache, but I played a role in hollowing out America by shipping a lot of stuff over to China and other places for cheap profit.
Yeah.
And I was good at it. And so when I look back at the kind of craven nature of the mission of many of my commercial endeavors, and then I see that the result of what we've wrought from that as a country now, and then I compare that to what was essentially a good nature, the honorable nature of what we were trained to do. At times I look and say, I spent more of my talent hollowing out America than building it. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's all just my story. And that's all me kind of making stuff up. But I think that I made a lot of people a lot of money. I was able to pocket a few bucks myself in the process. But in the end, at whose expense was it? And that's kind of the only serious part of the podcast. Ed Pygott came on and talked about how he helped ship a bunch of jobs out of the country. I feel very much in the spiritual house of that is like, what have I contributed to from 1991 on? So, most of the stuff that I built is gone because it was outsourced and shipped off to India or China or whatever, right? So, what did we build? Well, we built a lot of hotel stays. So that'd be the only thing that I don't even really regret, but I just look and say, well, that was kind of a waste of energy.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, you have lived a life a storybook life, really. And there's so many of our classmates that have stories that I wish more people would get on here, because it's not always about being the CEO or an ambassador or whatever it is. Every one of us has a story that I think needs to be told, and it's a great way to reconnect and then to learn.
That's such a great point. I do this podcast, and a lot of people will say to me, "No, I'm not that interesting." And I say, "Oh, and I go through all the motions of like, oh my goodness." And I asked you to do this because I very kindly, 3 other classmates offered to do this. And I felt in myself, well, my story's not that interesting, right? It's kind of a natural thing. You think it's not, but really, if you listen to all of our stories, it's very interesting. And we all were wired to get out there and do things. Your own story about the fact that you flew all the way till your very last day in the Army. It's like your story. I mean, all these stories are just astonishing. And that's, I think, the nature of the academy. You get these crazy stories. I really, really strongly resist every class has 5 interesting people in it. Like the 3 that became ex-star generals and the 3 that became really rich people and own hockey teams or whatever,
Right.
and then all the rest is just kind of the rest. I think the rest is the more interesting story.
Well, I mean, I look at it like Ron Anglin.
Yeah.
What he does to me is just fantastic, and I don't know how many. I would love to get him on, have you get him on and tell his.
Yeah, I reached out to him. Yeah, absolutely.
Because
the thing is, if you took the measure, you say, okay, let's set aside money and stuff and whatever, right? Set that aside and say, let's stack rank classmates based on how many people that they've made happy.
Yeah. Or they positively affected their life.
Ron Anglin would be like the top of the class.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? It's just literally you shift the metric and the class restacks, right?
Well, that gets back to our class ranking syndrome.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
you look at Scott Womack. I mean, listen to his stories. Like, he said they're in overalls in West Virginia. Well, let me tell you about when I was in Chad. It's like, what?
Yeah.
What? Yeah.
And it was just, I was in Chad. So what? Doesn't everybody do it?
I would tell you, this is a quick story. I was skiing with classmates recently, and we were on a ski slope. And there was Justin Whitney, Ranger, jumped in Panama. Paul Kelly, Ranger, jumped in Panama. Landon Lack, been over to Iraq. I'd done my G2 time in Iraq. Dean and Dorman was there. Dino. I mean, this was like a rogues gallery of experience. If you took all of our experience and you couldn't fit it in the internet, right? And we've been on the ups and downs. And this woman in front of us got very worked up because she felt like we didn't. John Strickler was in that group as well, who blowing stuff up in Korea and was like a programmer for Accenture. I mean, you're talking about a real rogues gallery here, right? And so this woman got upset because we didn't quite show her the correct deference in terms of ski etiquette or whatever. And you could make the case maybe she was out of line, whatever. But let's just assume we were not proper in our location where our skis were. And she just like something out of a YouTube video. And I was like, man, these are the wrong dogs to kick.
Yeah, exactly.
You had more combat experience. But what was awesome is the group just kind of went whatever, man. Just like no ego, just whatever. I mean, did you see that? Yeah, it was very funny, right? But I was like, boy, lady, if you're going to get sideways with one group, this is not the group.
Yeah, exactly. The old plebe where they're yelling at you and you're thinking, oh, what's for lunch?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
And they know it too, right? They know it too. So
that's funny.
yeah.
So
Look, great stuff. So that's the basic story, Riney, right there. It's been a heck of a run. And you know, I was just down. I saw Andy Napoli down in Savannah. I'm heading up to DC, going to see Roger Karstens. Heading back up to the academy, we'll see a bunch of classmates there. I stop in to see Gabalden. So it's just a constant joy to see classmates catch up and have a good time. So,
I say this from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate what you do because you've connected me to some of our classmates that I haven't known, and also reconnected me to some that I have known. And it's basically because of this. So you've lived your purpose. It's worked.
I'm one day, each day at a time. I was just down in Charleston at the Founders Day, and the oldest grad was class of 49.
That's amazing.
And this gentleman got up and he made some very funny remarks about being the oldest grad. And then he said, I only have one piece of advice to give you. So this would be a version of the 80-year-old. He says, get together with classmates, get together with classmates, get together with classmates. You will begin losing them, and you'll not ever regret getting together with a classmate when they're still alive. So I think that's great advice to live by for all of us. And hopefully we can continue doing that. And hopefully this podcast can give a little bit of a chance for folks to connect up.
Yeah, and I'm gonna do an ad here. Classmates, your story's worth it. Get on with PLAF. Have a laugh. Enjoy it.
Absolutely. Thanks for doing this, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Courage Never Quits podcast, where any member of the class of 1986 who is willing to tell their story will be a guest. To get the word out and stay up to date on the latest episodes, hit the like and subscribe button. With over 900 living graduates, we have a lot of stories to tell, and you don't want to miss any of them. We'll see you in the next episode.